So far we've created the service layer. We have created the presentation layer with some controller layer mixed into it. Now the next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be making our application configurable. So let's talk about what that looks like. So we have a framework called the Configuration API. So let's take a look at the Configuration API and what it looks like. And so in the UI of Liferay, we have an area called System Settings. System Settings is typically where you're going to look when you're trying to configure some of the common settings of Liferay. Behind the scenes, the System Settings section is actually being implemented by what we call the Configuration API. So the Configuration API allows for us to make our applications, well, configurable. Configuration API takes precedence over the portlet preferences and the portlet configuration framework. So it's kind of one of those higher up, depending on which settings we select. But generally speaking, this is the higher up the food chain. Portlet preferences can still be used. You can go into individual portlets and configure them. When we're working with the Configuration API, this is going to be using OSGI technology. So the OSGI configuration admin service is the sort of backbone of making Liferay's Configuration API work. So OSGI's configuration admin, this is what makes specific OSGI bundles or OSGI or Liferay modules or OSGI bundles essentially configurable dynamically. So the configuration admin is what allows us to make changes on the fly to these OSGI bundles. And this is part of the OSGI compendium as well. Got a link there if you want to read a little bit more on that. So what are some of the key features of the configuration admin, the configuration API? Key value pairs, right? So we're going to have a specific key that represents a property, and we can change the value of that key. They're going to be typed, right? So you can have different types, whether it's a list or a string or something like that, or a collection. They're also going to be scoped. So how far reaching, what effect does it have on the landscape of Liferay? Does it affect literally everything, or is it one specific application? That's the idea of scope. And this can be programmatic or file-based. So what this means is what we do within the UI can also be done programmatically, or it can be done within a specific file. We'll go into those details soon. So when we're dealing with type, or typing, not the typing on our keyboard, but when we're dealing with types, our key value pairs can have a number of different types: integer, long, string, a URL, a collection, or maybe something that we customize. Now, dealing with scope, right? How far, what realm does our setting have effect in? So starting from the top, we have system. This will impact our whole Liferay instance and every single Liferay instance. In essence, it could be seen as the whole JVM. So that's system. It's quite literally everything. The next one is virtual instance. Within one single Tomcat server or one instance of Liferay, you can have virtual instances. So instead of spinning up a brand new server to start another Liferay instance, you can create a virtual instance with some restrictions in that virtual instance. So all of that to say, virtual instance affects another instance within the same Tomcat box, for example. Site, right? This is going to impact the configuration of all of our sites, but you can always go in to a specific site and kind of change the individual site's settings if you want. So it'll set a default for all of our sites within Liferay. and then portlet instance, just that. For a specific portlet or a specific application, it'll change the configurations of that. And then for each portlet instance, if you place a portlet on a page, you can configure the settings of it if you want. So how does this all happen? What are the different ways in which we can configure the applications that we currently have? So we can start off in the UI. In the UI, under the system settings section is where you can configure these settings. Now with the settings that you do configure, you can export them. They'll be exported as a CFG file, and you can take that CFG file, go to a completely new Liferay instance, and copy and paste that CFG file in the Liferay home OSGI configs directory, and then your configuration will be picked up based off of that file. And last, our component configurations can also be read from the Go shell. Making changes to our components configurations, you can read those properties through the Go shell or through the web console. So let's go ahead and take a look at how we're able to create a system-wide portlet configuration for a specific application, like a custom application. So we start off over in our build.gradle. Over in our build.gradle, and we're going to add whatever dependencies that we need, right? Assuming we know what they are ahead of time. So we'll start there. After that, we'll move on to the BND tools, or the bnd.bnd file, where we'll add the following header. Once we do that, we're going to be creating a new interface. When we create the interface, we're going to have the @metaOCD annotation. The most important aspect of the @metaOCD is the ID. And so with that ID, this is how we're able to target this specific configuration. So the ID in MetaOCD is very, very important. In the interface itself is where we're going to be defining the specific attributes or properties that we want to modify. So for each property that we want to modify, we're going to do two things. First thing is we're going to have the @metaAD. So @metaAD, using that annotation, will allow us to define what attribute are we going to be modifying. Does it have any default values? Is it a required property that I need to set? Once you set those different things, you're then going to have a method that corresponds with the property. Here, for example, we have the @metaAD. We have a default value of false. We have a description of the field or property, show hello description. We have a name for the property, right, show hello name, and it is not required. So required equals false. If I'm going to do anything to this specific property, we have the show hello method to help us out. So this part here, create the configuration interface, is kind of setting the stage for the next part. So the next part here is how we can actually get those properties configured. So the first part is at the component annotation, we can target the specific configuration PID. So over in the interface, we have the ID @metaOCD. Here in step 4, we are selecting that specific ID number or ID in configuration PID. After that, towards the bottom, first thing we will do after we have the @activate and @modified is instantiate a module configuration object. This module configuration object is just like what we've done in OSGI. So whenever we want to instantiate a service object, we follow the same pattern. So module configuration is the interface that we created in the previous step, and we're creating this reference object based off of it, _module configuration. One thing to note here when we're creating this configuration object is that it has to be volatile. From there, the configuration object, we're going to be grabbing or creating this object to be configurable based off of the module configuration class and properties. Right, so whenever the property or a property changes, our module configuration object will be called, and then that's where we can actually make the change. So key aspects here, we're targeting the ID of the interface we created in the previous step. We create a configuration object based off of the interface we created in the previous step, and it must be volatile. And then we need to make sure we have the @activate and @modified so that whenever a property does change, we can pick it up and then actually modify or make the change. Cool. So from here, right, we can take that configuration object, right, when a change is happening or when we want to set the property, we can do so like this. So in this example, we're in a portlet component, or maybe a MVC render command would be better here. Either way, within the render request object, we're going to set an attribute. The attribute is going to be show hello. So that'll be the value. And then we're going to take the show hello, and it's going to get passed over to the show hello. All of that to say, we are setting the property that we created in the interface to show hello. So we'll move on from here, and we'll take a look at some of the other annotations, or at least some of them that we've seen already. So @meta_ocd and @meta_ad are part of BND tools, or the BND library. So again, BND tools still helping us out along the way. We can also use their equivalents, the object class definition and attributes definition annotations. That's how we can do it in the OSGI world. And so that's how you can see the correlation. OCD stands for object class definition, AD attribute definition. So you can use either one depending on preference. But keep in mind that the BND annotations are only available to us at runtime. So let's go ahead. We're going to make our gradebook application configurable, or we're going to integrate the gradebook application into the configuration admin or configuration API. So with that, let's go ahead. We'll follow these steps here, and very similar to what we have done before. We'll start off by adding the proper dependencies within our build.gradle. We'll then add that specific line in the bnd.bnd file. We'll create the interface, or the configuration interface. We'll then create the configuration provider, kind of the implementation that we saw. Right? We'll create a portlet instance configuration user interface, a JSP, to actually be able to configure what we're trying to do. And then we're going to configure or make the configuration with a render command. Deploy and then test. So let's go ahead and we'll check this out.